Morning, I have a special treat. I kept kind of giving you the teaser that I'd have somebody special, hoping that he would agree to come, and Dr. Wooden has agreed to be here, so just a moment I'm going to have him come up. But this is kind of where we're going to wrap up this series on mental health, and then next week, as promised, after the end of a long series where we cover a lot of stuff, I'll give you a question and answer. So I hope you've been writing down some of the questions that you've had throughout this series and even some of the questions that will be sparked by Dr. Wooden's presentation today. Bring those with you next week, and we'll spend as much time as we need addressing those questions, looking at them biblically, and hope to come to some kind of answer. But I think through all of this, I've been so pleased. Many of you don't know, but the number of people that have reached out to me and the church through this series has been almost overwhelming, really. We've had so many people that are not associated with Hannah's Creek that join us on Facebook, watch online, and they send emails, text. So that was my prayer through this series, that we would spark a conversation about mental health and how mental health and the Bible work together. And I'm so excited today to introduce Dr. Michael Wooden, who's a colleague, and I think he's going to bring some excellent thoughts for us to consider. And I look forward to what he's going to say. So I want you to welcome me in joining Dr. Michael Wooden.
Just right and left.
Yeah, right and left. Yep.
Thrilled to talk to Sean. I work at the Pavilion with him at Reed Healthcare, and I've heard a little bit about the series each time, so I'm excited to participate. And there's my screen. Thank you. Just trying to get oriented. I had an uncle that was a pastor down in the South in Louisiana, and a phrase that they would have is, are you losing your religion, or I'm losing my religion? That just generally meant I'm having kind of a breakdown. I've reached the end of my rope. So it's just something I thought about as a way to begin. I have to deal with mental health an awful lot. I'm what's called a clinical neuropsychologist. Anybody ever heard of that before? You have? Well, not too many. We're usually found in big cities, big hospitals. I worked at Children's in Boston and Philadelphia and up in Chicago, and that's where you usually find us. And my specialty is kids with genetic disorders, autism, and trauma, kids that have been through a lot of trauma. So I work at the Pavilion with kids that have trauma, and then I work in Richmond with kids that have autism. There's a genetic disorder that I study that's called 22q, and I'm just honored to be here. So Sean said that he'd like me to talk about schizophrenia and trauma, some other disorders, so I'm going to do that. But let me just introduce you to me. I'm broken. Anybody here broken? I am definitely broken. And a lot of the people that I work with are broken, and they're given these formal diagnoses. When I was a kid, I didn't like to be pigeonholed. We had to take a test every year. I'm from Massachusetts. And we had to take a test called the Myers-Briggs, and it would give you a code. And my code is ENFP. And my teachers knew it. And sometimes they'd use it as a weapon. Well, you're an ENFP. I know why you're acting the way that you are. And I didn't like to be pigeonholed, but right now that's what I do. I work with kids and find out what they have, but I try to do it in a kinder, gentler way. And probably the best experience for me as a Christian is realizing I'm broken. It frees me to work with other people and understand them better. I'm definitely a believer, lifelong believer, and passionate about it. I really feel blessed to be here. It's a great opportunity to talk to people about something I know and try to make it a little less mystical, magical, and understandable. And I'm not normal, so my car has a license plate not normal on it. And it's a big, long story that has more to do with farm vehicles than you believe, but it served me well in my role. And a lot of people like to know that I'm not normal. because it makes them feel more comfortable to talk to me. So I'm into self-deprecation, putting myself down, just to rise other people up. And that's the losing my religion came from my experience down in Louisiana, and people in general talking about, have we had a nervous breakdown, other things that refer to medical diagnoses, but in a different way. My passion for you guys is, I'm not going to harp on this, but there are many, many adults. 1 in 5 adults is going to have a mental health crisis this year, and many of them will deal with issues that I'm going to talk about. And honestly, the first people that they often go to are ministry people, a faith leader, a pastor, a deacon. That's where they go, faith community, for hope. And so I think for me it's important that I recognize that they will come here. They're part of you. We are. And attend weekly meetings, small groups, that kind of thing. So it's a passion. When Sean offered this to me, I thought this is great to be able to talk, because in some ways you're going to be front line, the community, to be able to respond to these people with Christ's love. And you're not really a whole church when there's members that are missing because of these issues. So that's my soapbox. Get into some fun stuff, the brain. So I'm a neuropsychologist. That means that I'm a psychologist, but then I went and did a residency and a postdoc fellowship for research in a medical institution. And I always think to myself, how can you practice without knowing about the brain? Of course we have to know about the brain. It is not blue, but it looks pretty cool, I think. So some amazing facts about it. I love this. In this time of fuel crisis, and I'm thinking we're going to have an electrical grid for cars. Who's going to pay for that? Where's it going to come from? Where's the energy going to come from? I really don't know. But our brain is electrical without a plug, which is amazing. Only God could do that. It generates 20 watts of energy. We could hook a light bulb up to our brain and power it. It's amazing to me. And we have food, eggs, maybe a little bacon. It's amazing that it actually does. Our thoughts travel at greater than 268 miles per gallon. Miles per hour. And we have all these cells, well over a football field if we unfold it. Our brain gets bigger by folding. It's kind of hard to understand, but the little gyrations on that brain are folds, and it keeps folding in order to have more surface area, but we don't have beanbags for heads. So that's what it does, and if you were to unfold it, it would be well over a football field long, which is amazing. Only God can do this. It gets larger and more complex by folding in on itself. We have the biggest brain in proportion to our body, but the whale has the biggest one. It's okay, 15 pounds, you can have it. We have 70,000 thoughts a day, 49 thoughts a minute, but 80% of our thoughts, of normals, people that do not have a disorder, are negative. I mean, you think about it. Think about the inner speech that we have. We tend to put ourselves down quite a bit. We do. Many people are quite negative about the future. And so if you think about that, and you think about people that have a disorder, how negative are their thoughts and how persistent are they? They get better with prayer. These are all studies. These are all evidence-based studies. Acceptance of others, empathy, community help. They all reduce our negative thoughts. Unlike computers, our storage in our brain is unlimited. However, we cannot multitask. Okay? All we do, our brain can only focus on one thing at a time. So people who multitask are switching back and forth. We can really only focus at one thing at a time. And we're connected to the heart, the brain, And the biggest thing for me is it's made by God, our brain. Only a God like our God could make a brain that is so developing and has so many positives. Joy is one of the things that's supposed to help us to really be able to deal away with negativity. And I think about negativity as the function of thoughts of this world that are from Satan. God spoke this world into existence, which is, to me, the most amazing thing. He uttered a sound, a speech sound, and created the world. And so that creation, that voice is still echoing, but there's a challenging voice in our world too, and I think that his voice contributes to the negativity that we often feel. For somebody that's been through a lot of education, this is a little bit difficult for me. So Paul was called out for being insane because he studied too much. But he was being called out by somebody who didn't really understand his purpose, and he went on and talked about, no, I'm not really crazy, this is God's plan. And I think we need to stand up and be able to do that too, even when we're talking about mental illness. This is the book that is used to diagnose people with mental illnesses. So this is the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It used to be that we thought we could reduce it all to statistics and diagnose people like that. This is the manual I use quite a bit to diagnose people that are having life issues, and that's what I see them as. Jesus healed lots of people, and sometimes they refer to them as lunatics, which in the Bible translations is the closest that we have to mental health issues. And I love it. I kind of will hear, I'm going to forget his name now, but he sings, I've Got Friends in Low Places. Anybody know that? Garth Brooks. And I just think, and so didn't Jesus. He had lots of acquaintances in low places and worked with them and healed them. One thing I have to talk about is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is often, as you're going through your education, is something that people fear a little bit because it's rare and it has some unique aspects to it. I work with kids with a genetic disorder called 22q, and it sits on the same genetic site as schizophrenia. So the kids that I see often have hallucinations and those kind of things. So it's interesting because they share characteristics. So I see both issues. It's hard to make a diagnosis, and you have to interact with other healthcare professionals to really get it. And it happens in childhood too. So I've seen children with this issue, and it can be scary because it's unusual. And one of the things that they have are conflicting emotions. They oftentimes have delusions and hallucinations, and that can be scary when you see it if you don't know what to expect. It's about 1 in every 100 people. It's extremely complex, difficult to distinguish from other mental health problems, so you really need somebody who knows what they're doing and that you can trust them. There can be a number of different changes that they have. They vary. There's a lot of chaos with schizophrenia. And it's believed to be caused by an imbalance of the brain's natural chemicals. So sometimes people think, is this a Satan-oriented mental health disorder? And what we would say is that no, it's really chemical imbalances, and it can be treated with both psychotherapy and medication. It's different from multiple personalities, or what we call dissociative identity disorder. This is what we think of when we think of the movie Carrie, or people that have 150 different personalities that are buried. That is very different than schizophrenia, and that diagnosis is even more complex. But the internet has made it popular. It's popular to think somebody could have a different personality for every manifestation of their behavior. And I think a lot of people on the internet play it up and would say that more people have it than really do. So it's gotten popular amongst a certain crowd. And it's good to know about it, but very, very few people have schizophrenia. Even fewer have multiple personalities. Anybody have questions about that? Okay, it's a scary area. People tend to fear that which we don't really know, and that can seem bizarre or odd. So the fact that somebody would hallucinate is something that can be very difficult for people to come to terms with. And once you get to know them and you start treating them, you can see some positive gains, yes. Well, it can happen in children, but mostly it happens in young adulthood is when we start to see it emerge. And it can be different disorders. So you can have Huntington's disorder and have hallucinations with that. So you have to check. You can have chemical imbalances in your body that could produce that as well. So it's good to go to a mental health practitioner, a physician that you really trust in, with the results, and if things seem unusual, get second opinions. This is one that some of the medications can have a negative impact. They can cause movement disorders with some of the medications, so it's really good to know who you're talking to about it. Did that answer your question? Yeah, call out. I don't want to talk in psychobabble, which a lot of us do because this is a language that we use every day, but here I'm talking to all of you, so feel free to call out. So schizophrenia has thought problems, and other disorders do too, and thought problems are a loss of contact with reality. That's what we're afraid of, that some of these people get so unreal that it seems like, are we ever going to get them back from their own mind and the irreality that they have? Sometimes people with schizophrenia and thought problems will have difficulty distinguishing between what's real and what's not. That can be very scary. They have a lack of insight into their own problems. They really need somebody to help them guide them out of it. They can often feel ideas of persecution, like everybody's against them, that there's a plot being hatched against them. So if you see somebody getting very negative and feeling like everybody's against them all the time, it's not the sign of schizophrenia, but it is one of the signs. Disordered thought, just not normal types of thought. Trauma is also a big issue, so I'm going to include it in two of the definitions that I have, and just let me know about my time, Sean. Delusions are when somebody believes ideas that are clearly false, people are reading their thoughts, or that they can control other people's minds, that the government is against them and has a master plot with license plates that have a P, they're all people against them. That type of reasoning happens. Hallucinations, hear voices inside their heads. They're either auditory or visual, or see people that are there, see phenomenon that other people don't see. And if it gets more bizarre, like some people feel like that they can smell color or taste emotions. That's not schizophrenia. That's a different thing, which is not it's not uncommon for people to do that. But when you see other people, especially if they're telling you to do things, that's a hallucination that has to be worked on. For people with trauma, they can have dissociative experiences. So another group I work with, a growing group, people with trauma. Used to be Vietnam vets. In the 1970s, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, came out. to deal with the fallout of having been in Vietnam. And it characterized many of the people who fought there, but today it's childhood experiences. And let me just tell you, there's some horrific things that happen to kids and to adults. Violence perpetrated against adults create traumatic experiences. And one of the ways that they deal with it, that their brain helps protect them, is that it feels like they're outside their bodies. And they go to a safe place for many people. But that's what a dissociative experience is. They're dissociating from the world. And then the other one is flashbacks, which are intrusive photo memories of things that have happened to them that can be disturbing to deal with. These are real things that people go through. So the outlook for a person with schizophrenia, just so you know, 3 recover quite well. 3 recover to a lesser extent but are able to be independent. So that's more than half a positive outcome. 3 require extensive help and may have to live in supportive care facilities. And one may not survive. It can be one that leads to suicide. So it's an important one to know about and to get the right treatment. And we do more about kicking the tires of our vehicles when we buy them than we do researching mental health professionals and making sure they're getting the treatment that they need. So it's really important to invest yourself, read all kinds of materials. There are lots of advocacy groups out there. NAMI, N-A-M-I, is probably one of the best. So I'll include some links in this presentation. I'll send it to Sean as a PDF. Trauma, to me, it's one of the most rising areas, especially with young kids. And the more adverse experiences kids have, the more unregulated they are, the more problems that they have with emotional self-control. I used to be a school administrator. My wife is here. She's a school administrator for K2, a K2 building. We see more problems now with discipline at K2 than we do at high school. And this is because kids are coming in dysregulated. A lot of times they've gone through trauma, child abuse, other things that make them less able to control themselves. And they have very few coping mechanisms. They're not being taught the coping mechanisms that they used to. I was a high school administrator. We used to expect kids to kind of develop problems as they got older, and then behavioral difficulties were developed. Now they're coming into school with behavioral difficulties, and sometimes the schools aren't equipped to know how to deal with them. And a lot of it is what we call trauma or adverse childhood experiences. So it was started in the 70s to address Vietnam vets, now encompasses other sources of it: abuse, violent relationships, assault, sexual assault, all the above. Younger and younger children, they really don't have coping mechanisms. I count what are called adverse childhood experiences, which can include everything from abuse, significant abuse, sexual abuse, to how many times have they gone to a different school. I grew up in a town where I went to the same school system my whole career, okay? There are kids that switch and go 30 times, 40 times to a new school. How many residential changes they've had. I lived in the same house for most of my childhood. Lots of people switch, and every time you switch, we just sold our house. We lived in Oxford for many years and sold our house. And gosh, you get attached, and it's a difficult thing to move. And we were prepared. So many people are not prepared, and it can be one of the most stressful times of life. If you're a child, it can become even more stressful. So I've counted them, and there are unkind, evil people out there in the world who really mess with young kids. And it's just amazing to see how those experiences can add up and make children dysregulated. Probably the best thing to say, They cannot regulate themselves. They can't get their emotions in order, and they have great difficulty trusting people. And so don't adults who have been through trauma. So it negatively impacts all of those things: attachment, trust. Trust. Most people with trauma develop what we call armor. It's their armor that protects them through the day because they're so distrustful of people and unsure if you're somebody that's going to perpetrate something against them. So they develop this armor, which is a defensive mechanism, but it sometimes doesn't let people in. And that's what happens to adults, and sometimes social relationships can be really difficult because of it. I like to think that we, as humans, as Christians, can be anti-fragile too. That we have strength built in on us, that we are somebody who, through a prayer life, can build the strength of God behind us and have confidence that we were wonderfully and beautifully made. And that kind of change can happen for people who've been through it. And I think about that, for I am the Lord that heals you. And this is just a graphic from a book about a God-sized brain. And that we need to know that that's our brain, the contours of it, but that God is there. God made the brain. We are made in His image. We are made to succeed and live a life worth living. That's what we are as Christians. So it seems silly for me to have to say it and have a graphic, but God created the brain. And when we have disorders, He offers solutions, and I believe that. I have tips. I'll just give this as a PDF about dealing with people. So these are communication tips for family members and friends, things to do when people have disorders. What could you possibly do? Tips for responding to crisis situations, things that you shouldn't do, and things that you should do. I'm sorry, that was before there. So they're simple things. Most of it is you validate people. You listen to people, you validate their experience. You don't necessarily tell them that what they're doing is right, but that you're there to listen. You're not going to leave them unless you're in danger, and that they matter to you. We don't hear that very often. People don't stop these days and tell us positive things. We aren't oriented that way. So if you can take a change and say, I'm going to mention more positive things to people, we don't. It's uncomfortable for people. When people say positive things in general, studies have said people don't know how to receive it. We're not used to hearing positive comments, and we're usually a little bit skeptical about why somebody's saying something positive about us. But in crisis situations, that can be one of the best things to do. Acknowledge, look at them, don't look away. And there's other recommendations here. And this is for dealing with schizophrenics, but also other people with just life problems. So I love this picture. Anybody familiar with this picture? It's a great painting of Christ holding somebody who is collapsing. And I just think we're all called to have faith in a loving God. And that loving God, if we work, it will stimulate the brain to heal and grow. So we can all make a difference today. So I want you to know that. This is an infographic about God healing the brain. The red is all about the power of prayer. And I want you to know studies were done on the power of prayer before it was ever called mindfulness. We call it mindfulness today, to meditate, to take time. I don't have a problem with that concept, but before it was ever called mindfulness, which is supposed to appeal for people from other faiths and not faith at all, to just meditate, that the power of prayer is amazing. And the brain studies that have been done about it are confirmatory about that. Taking time to learn and to pray every day and to pray in a deep way. So spiritual experiences, we show these colorful graphs. They're kind of exciting for brain people, but they all indicate that there's activation in the brain when we're doing spiritual things like talking in tongues or worshiping. And I think about these two scriptures. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will be changed into a different person. And then for me, just the idea of fixing your thoughts on Jesus. It's mentioned in the Bible a few different times. And that, to me, the best way to fix your mind on Jesus is to pray. And if you fix your mind on Jesus, if you focus on joy, I think that joy is seen through... I just talked to my wife, actually, today. She attended a seminar on joy, and now I can't remember exactly what I was going to say, except that it's a powerful motivator for change and through prayer. We've done brain studies on the parts of the brain that will help to move you forward by contemplating or praying when you're in intense prayer. This is an example of a scan that's done in one particular part of the brain, the parietal lobe, that sees increased blood flow to that brain when you pray, meaning it's activating that part of the brain. And I love this graphic. I love the Our Father, and that's what the healing and centering power of deep prayer, through praying however you do it. If you love written prayers, if you pray on your own, the deep nature will impact the brain and move you forward. I'm sure, Sean, you talked about this in other scriptures during anxiety. You had a discussion on anxiety and depression. Anxiety is one of the biggest things, because the more anxious we become, the more, this is a psychobabble word, but have you ever heard the word ruminate before? Anybody? Ruminate? It comes from cows chewing on their cud, okay? They just do it over and over and over again. And the origin of the word comes from that, and it means us as humans, when we're anxious, when we think about things too much, that we can ruminate about them. And just our minds go over and over and over, and the more you do that, the more you can have depression and other experiences. So it's great to pray to God, to give your burdens to Him, so that you don't end up ruminating. And we have to be worried about that as we get older, because the more time that we have to think, sometimes the more we ruminate. And rumination, thinking about over and over and over again, can lead to greater problems with depression and anxiety and the other issues. So I love this graphic, because that's what Jesus offers us. He really does. I believe in the transformative power of prayer and the wonder of being a Christian, that the brain that God created us with can be changed. It can be rerouted. We can have thoughts that think differently. And it takes a community of Bible-believing people, I think, to really help. And just wanted to give you that message. I have other stuff, but I think that covers the main thing. Have I talked way over my time? So I'm open for any. Do you want me to be open for questions, or are they supposed to write them down and discuss them next week? Anybody have any questions? It can be far-reaching. I work with ADHD, depression, all those things. So if you have any questions, yeah.
I work in the public education system, and I've really been noticing so many changes in our students post-pandemic. What insight might you share for educators in my position and for parents of young people?
That's a great question, and there's been a bevy of new articles about and studies about how we're going to expect to see, somebody in my position is going to expect to see many more people for evaluations post-COVID. And a lot of it has to do with things like brain fog. You're slower than you used to be. Your memory isn't as good. It's a worldwide phenomenon that's been for years now. I mean, there's young kids that have only lived in the pandemic. And so we're expecting trauma from it. I think of many kids who had special needs that weren't able to go to their classrooms, which are havens of safety for them, and just people in the general population. When there is crises that happen, we typically have responses that can be depressive, anxious, so I expect to see much more. And I don't really know how we're going to get a great handle on it. I'm thankful that we're ending the mask mandates and that schools are going to be able to function. And hopefully all the teachers come back, because there's many that have left because of that. And that's a fear for me, how many teachers have chosen to leave because of the increase in behavioral issues at school. Does that answer your question? I think it's on the radar. We expect that there's going to be many more. Pediatricians expect it, general practitioners, and now how are we going to measure it? And what are we going to call it? Is there going to be a COVID disorder? I expect there is in some ways.
So really, this is showing up on the ACEs chart in terms of trauma, much like some other adverse childhood experiences.
Yes, and it's really hard because you know what? There's so many kids that have adverse experiences, but there's many people also claiming trauma, and it's become such a broad category. I almost feel like the word is overused. That's why I mentioned anti-fragility. That sometimes we have to watch being so willing to use the word trauma, and that I've gone through trauma, and maybe we need to also learn to stand and realize that we are also anti-fragile. And it's controversial, but a lot of people show excellent post-traumatic growth. So if you can get people with the right practitioner, I'll tell you a piece of therapy that I love is a Japanese pottery technique called kintsugi, Kintsugi. And I'll just tell you why it's poignant. So you use a piece of pottery and you break it, which seems crazy. But then you put the pottery back together with metal epoxy. And oftentimes the transformation of the pottery with the metal epoxy makes it look even more beautiful than it was before. And for patients that I have worked with, that is an amazing experience. Sometimes you can have parents put one of the pieces back together with the epoxy, and then it feels like the family is doing it together. Gosh, I cry at chick flicks sometimes too. So it's just a positive thing, and then that you could make, if it's just one person, you talk about all the pieces of who you are that you feel have fallen apart, and you put them together. Oh, power and control over who you are can come from that kind of experience. And talking to people is a verbal form of kintsugi. It really is, because we're hoping to take a person and put them back together, because many of us are really broken. We really are. That's why I started with it, and it's good to just realize it. We're imperfect. We've been put on this earth, and we hope to go to heaven, and we've been saved, but some of us don't realize that the pieces can be put together and that God can help us do that. Other questions? Yes, sir. Well, I take a number, but I think first of vitamin. Anybody remember that? Am I the only person? I'm really old. I love Lucy, and she did her thing with vitamin. Anyways, but I'm telling you, I take vitamins, and I'm very specific about which ones to take. And during COVID, I listened to multiple medical practitioners and settled on one guy in New York. And I think you really have to study them. It's really hard, and I listened to a radio show in the morning hosted by a guy named Hugh Hewitt. Anybody know him? And he recommends Relief Factor. And I hear about Relief Factor. It's supposed to take away your pain. It's all natural ingredients, and I don't know. I've got relatives that have terrible pain, and they've tried lots of other things, so I thought, well, maybe I should try that for them. It is not regulated like medications. There are not studies that are done on supplements, so I just advise you to be wary. I heard one last night, Relaxium. And I don't know if it's really going to help put you to sleep. I found something that works for me, but everybody's different. And everybody's different in their responsiveness to schizophrenia, too, and the interventions that are done for that. It's not a great answer, but I hear you. It's a big growth area. People spend lots of money. And I work with autistic kids. People will spend lots and lots of money to try and cure autism, and to my knowledge, there's not really a great cure, and so I always feel a burden for parents. I don't want them spending thousands. I had a parent that would fly her kid from Chicago to California to get a very unique type of therapy, and he was 9 years old, flying. Okay, now they had the money, they had the means, but really? Was that really effective? It would seem more personality driven, and when you met with the individual, you felt like your kid was going to make all the difference in the world. And so part of my role is to help parents really know if they can trust interventions, but supplements, because it's not regulated, we don't have great studies. So I know, and they're very appealing, the commercials. D3, I do think D3 is important. Anything else? Yeah. Oh.
First of all, thank you very much for being here today. I'm watching church attendance here. Everyone's paying attention. We are, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I have a question that perhaps is a little outside of your expertise, but I'm sure someone like you can at least help me, and I would assume several others in here. The world news right now is traumatic in itself. When those of us who went through military training went through it, we were taught it was easy to understand who a combatant was.
Yep.
A combatant was someone who took up arms against you. But I turned the television on, and we're shooting women and children. I try to deal with logic at a greater extent than emotion when I make decisions. But that's becoming, I'm in a tenuous position right now when I watch the news. I won't say it's traumatic, but it's upsetting to a new degree. It's 1939 all over again. Can you give us some helpful hints? There's prayer, there's faith, there's a value in the cross. But can you give us some helpful hints how to deal with this story?
Well, thank you for your service. Any other veterans here, military people? I so appreciate the service. I think discussion is really important, that sometimes we hear this news, we get overwhelmed, and we think, I'm not going to talk about that. And on my way over here, I was talking to my wife and said, it's kind of hard. One of the studies is from Christianity that was done by a Christian neuroscientist, is how important experiencing joy is. I'm like, that's kind of a hard message to sell sometimes, especially when the world is the way that it is right now, how tenuous it is. But joy, trying to find any opportunity for commonplace joy, joy through a discussion, visiting another serviceman that could talk to you about the similar feelings, I think is one of the best things to do, just to let emotions out through discussion, through artwork. I think that it's a hard hard thing to come to terms with what's happening because we have so little control over it. And I think working together, sharing, is probably one of the best things that you can do. Serving others and creating opportunities for joy. I try every day to experience joy, and I work with kids that are really struggling, and I'm telling you, there's desperation, abuse, and anger for them, but there's joy around every corner. That even amongst those kids that are having such difficulty, I can always find some element of joy that they have found about themselves. So if that can happen for people that are experiencing such emotional trauma, it can happen for you too. And I think sometimes it's a daily choice that we have to make, that's Scripture-led, to find joy and to find peace. And I know it's easy for me to say that because I'm going to pack up my things and go back to Dark County. But
Dr. Wooden, one of the things that we're going to do after Easter that I think speaks to this question specifically is we're going to kind of journey through the book of Lamentations and talk about learning how to lament in a biblical way, because I think that's part of the process of dealing with some of the news that we do have, even addressing how do we come out of a post-pandemic society. Learning to grieve appropriately and to lament appropriately, I think, helps us build some resiliency and also find joy even in the circumstances that are difficult. So that's where we'll move after an Easter series.
I think that's right on. I deal with a lot of kids who have bereavement issues and adults. And let me just say, I don't know if this is comforting to you, but learning to grieve, to deal with those issues is really important. But it's a lifelong process. People will often say, you've got to get closure. Do you hear what I'm saying? And sometimes we never really truly achieve closure, and it's okay for that, because the loss of somebody is a great emptiness in our life, and we have to find ways to find joy in that journey, and also to accept that this has happened and we need to find ways to move on and honor the person that we've lost. So I think that'll be a great thing to do, to become resilient. Okay? Yeah?
Where do you see the biggest need where the church can practically help?
Gosh, you know, years ago I went out to San Diego and got to see the Crystal Cathedral. Anybody remember that? Robert Schuller. And one of the things that was really impressive to me at that time was he had a really state-of-the-art psychological, psychiatric clinic. And it was right there in the church, and I thought, wow, that's really exciting. And kind of picturing myself having a corner office in the Crystal Cathedral. Not really. But what I loved about it was they actually made a commitment, and there was a way. Now it's a much bigger place in San Diego, so they had a lot of foot traffic, but finding a way to embrace community. And that slide that said, are you really a whole church if there are people missing from the church, and they're missing because they're mentally ill and need some support? So I think one of the best ways is to normalize mental illness, to see it as a life-functioning problem. One of my favorite psychiatrists, a guy named Harry Stack Sullivan, they actually think that the guy had schizophrenia, but controlled it, and that he was able to better know his patients because he went through some of that himself. And I just think, isn't that interesting? So the more we know people, the more we know what they're going through, the better we can respond to them. And that's why I start with, I'm broken. I've had all kinds of negative life experiences, and I've never been perfect in any way, but have gone through things that help me to understand other people. And so I think the church would be best if they could be responsive to that group and set up structures so that people can feel free to come in. And it's always an issue because once you let people come in and you open that, you've got to be ready for almost anything. But Jesus was ready for almost anything, and he dealt with the dregs of society and people that were considered the most different as well. So, I don't know. You just have to be ready. And I think God calls us to be ready to love everyone. Not to change the policies of the church or anything like that. Am I making sense? Okay. Anyone else? I think I've seen you on a billboard going to Connorsville. I just have to say, I've always wondered what the guy would look like in person. So looking good.
You're right. You have seen him. Hey, thank you so much. This is a good place to wrap things up, especially with the last question. And there's been, kind of one thing that God has continued to bring back in front of me as I've been studying for this whole series, and then the way you started today, introducing yourself as broken. I think one of the most critical things we can do as a church is to stop thinking in terms of us and them. Like there's a divide between what we would call quote unquote healthy people and quote unquote unhealthy people. The reality is we are all in this together. We are all broken. And it's so easy for us to say, well, those people, that type of person. And I think if we change our language even and say we, us, we have this mentality that it's us and them, and it's really not. We're all in this together. And I think the ultimate goal for any person that experiences any kind of illness, whether we would categorize it as mental illness or physical illness, our immediate reaction to that is we want God to deliver us from this. Because the people that I've encountered often struggle with the question, why did God do this to me? Why do I have this mental illness? And that question is based on the presupposition that we feel like God should deliver us from that situation. And for those of us that maybe don't struggle with or are honest about our struggles, maybe we're not honest about it. So I think all of us struggle to some degree with mental issues. We have to get to a new understanding of how God delivers people. I'm certainly there are times in life when God will deliver people from certain situations. Especially when we talk about substance use disorder, you talk to a lot of people that feel like God has delivered them from that addiction. But I think predominantly the way God delivers us is through those things. Right? He delivers us through the illness because we get to a point where we have to completely depend on Him and His restoring power. Dr. Wooden said it, there's really not any cures for these things. We treat the symptoms. We don't cure it. But God's plan for restoration, all of creation includes curing those things, delivering us into this person that will be whole, restored through the suffering that we experience in this life. And that's the narrative that provides hope. It's a lot more hopeful for me to know that God is restoring us through all of this rather than, well, what if God never delivers me from it? Am I a lost cause? Absolutely not. We are in the process of being restored. And I think that's where we as a church step in and say, we're all in this together. We are all currently being restored. We are in the process, and we want you to be part of that process with us. That's the community aspect. I hope you've enjoyed this. Next week, I hope you didn't ask all your questions, because next week I want some more questions, but I'm sure you'll come up with them. Thank you all for being so attentive through this. I'm going to close in prayer, and I'll do something different today. I'll close in prayer. The worship team can come and start to sing, but as they sing, feel free to start to move out. Feel free to talk to Dr. Wooden if you have any further questions, or myself will be here. And then, in a little bit of time, we have our last leadership class that we're going to finish up today. Thank God, it's been a long process, but today we're ending it. So for those of you that have been a part of that, stick around. We'll get that finished up. And coming up the rest of this week, we have our men's and women's group and stuff like that. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the work that you do in us, through us, and to us. Thank you for Jesus, who is the picture of hope and restoration in life, who demonstrated to us what it looks like to suffer and to be restored through that suffering. And God, we pray that our lives would be lives that really imitate his life, that we would become like him in all things, and know that we have the hope of resurrection to being fully restored, and that one day all of these illnesses and situations and circumstances that we experience in this life, one day you will restore all things, make us all new, and we will enjoy that state forever in your presence. Father, I pray for the many people who are in this community, in this state, in the nation, in the world that struggle with what we call mental illness. And I pray that even in those situations, you would reveal yourself to them and bring your peace and your joy into their lives. Even in those moments when they question your goodness or question your existence, God, continue to show yourself to them. And certainly, Father, we pray that in all of the situations that we see unfolding around the world that do cause us to be sorrowful, and we see the innocent lives of women and children and other people that are being taken, God, we ask that you would move and work in a way that only you can do. For the people that are causing this turmoil, God, move on their hearts, on the hearts of the people that are following their command. We pray that you would turn them against leaders that wish ill on people. And Father, continue to provide protection to people. And when things look bleak, continue to remind us of your steadfast faithfulness from generation to generation. And I pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.